Right, G, right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is being organized by Chandigarh Judicial Academy in collaboration with SEC Online. Today's webinar is on presumptions of constitutional limits and relevance by Mr. Bajilendra Singh Sara sir, who is an ADJ cum faculty member in Chandigarh Judicial Academy. Sir would be detailing this session for approximately 45 minutes. He has a presentation to share. Post 45 minutes, the question and answer round would be open up for the entire audience. You can post your questions during that time, and sir would be addressing all the questions individually. Without further ado, without taking much time of the platform, I will request Sara sir to please take the forum and help us with the wisdom that you want to share, sir. Sir, please, sir.
Thank you, Chetan. Thank you. First of all, I wish a very good morning to all the participants who have spared their valuable time to join me on this webinar and give me the opportunity to make the presentation on this topic, presumptions, constitutional limits and relevance. Now, so far as the topic of presumption is concerned, in all the modern legislation, be it NDPS Act, be it Prevention of Corruption Act, Negotiable Instrument Act, POCSO, we find reverse burden clauses in almost all these acts, and they play a pivotal role in adjudicating the cases under all these acts. Now I've divided my presentation into 4 segments. Chetan, can you play the PPT also?
Sir, it is live now, sir.
All right, thank you so much. So, in the first segment, I shall be sharing with all of you the constitutional limits within which reverse burden clauses can be upheld under the Indian law. In the second segment, I shall be discussing or sharing with you the reverse burden clauses under the NDPS Act, how they are operative, how they help us in adjudicating the cases under the NDPS Act. In the third segment, I shall be sharing with you all the reverse burden clauses under the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988. And the last segment, I shall be sharing with you the reverse burden clauses under the Negotiable Instrument Act 1881. Now, so far as the reverse burden clauses or presumptions are concerned, the general principle under the common law is that accused is presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. And secondly, it is the prosecution who is to prove the offense against the accused beyond all reasonable doubt. But in certain situation, this common law principle is altered by the legislature by providing certain presumptions in favor of the prosecution and against the accused, which under the law are known as reverse burden clauses. In a sense, these reverse burden clauses reverses the burden of proof from the prosecution and place that on the accused. Now we shall be discussing what are the constitutional limits within which these reverse burden clauses are constitutionally valid. Now, presumption sometimes are also known as the bats of the law, which are flitting in the twilight but disappearing in the sunshine of actual facts. Similarly, somebody has said regarding the presumptions that a presumption is like the poppy spread. You seize the flower and the bloom is shed, or like snowfall on the river, a moment seen and then gone. Now all these similes and metaphors which are applied to the presumption only indicates the fleeting nature of these presumptions. We assume facts under certain circumstances, but once the actual evidence comes on the record, they disappear. As I've already shared, the common law principle is that it is the duty of the prosecution to prove the guilt of the accused. This principle was laid down by the House of Lords in Woolmington case, and this Woolmington principle is subject to the legislation by the Parliament to the contrary. Now, the Supreme Court in Harbhajan Singh case had held that this common law principle is also a part of Indian criminal law jurisprudence. We often find that probably in none of the modern legislation also, and neither in the CRPC, we find the statutory incorporation of this principle. But despite that, it is a part of criminal law jurisprudence under the Indian law. Now, so far as the constitutional limits are concerned, within which these reverse burden clauses can be upheld. Now, every criminal offense has got two essential elements. One is the physical act, and second is the guilty mind. Now, the normal rule is that prosecution is required to prove both the elements of the offense beyond reasonable doubt. However, in certain situations, we find legislative interference carving out presumptions regarding certain facts. It could be either that the mens rea element can be presumed, sometimes even the certain physical act or the ingredient of the offense is also liable to be presumed as per the nature of the presumption provided in the act. And there are three exceptions where you'll find that this presumption gets dislodged, which is in favor of the accused. First is when the accused admits the actus reus and mens rea, but pleads a right of private defense. So once he has admitted the occurrence and all other acts, and he pleads the right of self or private defense, in that case, the burden is cast upon him to prove it, or at least cast a reasonable doubt in favor of such plea. The second is when the accused sets up a special case, such as the case of insanity, then both the evidential as well as the persuasive burden is cast upon him to establish the facts constituting such defense. The third exception is, which we probably are going to deal with in this webinar, are the statutory exceptions like under the NDPS Act, Corruption Act, Negotiable Instrument Act. Now, the principle and limits to uphold such kind of reverse burden clauses are: the prosecution must prove the foundational facts. Now, if in a given presumption, the law provides the assumption of a presumptive guilt of the accused and then reversing the burden upon him to disprove the same, such kind of reverse burden clauses would be unconstitutional and ultra vires of the principle of fair trial engrafted in Article 21 of the Constitution. The second principle is there must be rational connection between the foundational fact and the presumed fact, indicating the existence of a high probability of the presumed fact. Third is the various considerations which goes for enacting reverse burden clauses are that accused can be settled with the reverse burden of discharging negative facts. For instance, the Licensing Act, like NDPS Act, that the possession of the contraband itself is an offence unless and until the accused is able to show that he has a license, permit or authorization from the competent authority to possess it. Second is establishment of facts which are within his peculiar knowledge and which it would not be possible for the prosecution to know by any means. Third is relative ease of discharging the burden of certain facts. Then there are certain tests which have been evolved by the judicial courts to find out whether in a given situation the reverse burden clause would be within the limits of Constitution or would it transgress such limits. First test or principle is the state required to prove enough basic or essential facts constituting a crime so as to raise a presumption regarding the balance facts to bring home the offense against the accused? Second is, does the proof of these balance acts involve a burden to prove a negative fact? Third, are these balance facts within the special knowledge of the accused? And fourth is, does this burden, considering the aspect of relative ease for the accused to discharge it, subject the accused to any hardship or oppression? So these are the broad tests which have been evolved by the judicial courts to test the constitutional validity of reverse burden clauses. Now I shall be now switching to the second segment, and we shall be seeing the operation of reverse burden clauses under the NDPS Act. Day in, day out, we apply these presumptions, but let us see how practically and conceptually these reverse burden clauses operates and whether in our day-to-day working we are conforming to the practice or procedure by which these presumptions are to operate. Now we have two provisions under the NDPS Act. One is section 35 and other is section 54, which deals with the reverse burden. Section 54 stipulates that a presumption as to the commission of the offence may be raised on the following facts. Number one, possession of any contraband. Number two, possession of any apparatus specially designed or any group of utensils specially adopted for the manufacture of any contraband. Now let us suppose in a given situation, a person is found in his premises this apparatus, utensils, which are specially designed for the manufacture of any contraband, but no actual contraband has been found from the premises. Even then, the court can raise the presumption regarding the commission of the offence from the possession of these ancillary apparatus or paraphernalia which would be used for the manufacture of any contraband. The third is possession of any materials which have undergone any process towards the manufacture of contraband or any residue left of the materials from which the contraband has been manufactured. So even the possession of the material which have undergone transformation from step 1 to step 2 and has not reached the final step of manufacture of contraband, or where it has been already manufactured but residue is left from these possession or material of possession of these material, the presumption under section 54 may be raised by the courts. Second is section 35. It simply supplants the element of mens rea in the offences under the Act. So the prosecution is relieved from the burden of proving this element, and this element would automatically be supplanted by section 35 of the Act. Now let us briefly note the difference between both the provisions, that is 35 and 54. Now, so far as 35 is concerned, it is an instance of rebuttable presumption of law, whereas 54 is an instance of presumption of fact. 35 presumption is compulsory in nature. That is, once the physical act is proved by the prosecution, this will automatically chip in and supply the element of mens rea. Whereas presumption under 54 is only optional in nature, the court may or may not raise it depending upon the facts and circumstances of a case. Then last is section 35 is generic in nature, and 54 is attracted only in situation where possession is one of the fundamental or foundational fact or ingredient of the offense. And 35 relates to presumption of guilty mind. 54 relates to presumption regarding the commission of the offense on proof of the foundational fact. Now there is one expression under section 54 which you will also come across under the Prevention of Corruption Act also, as well as under the Negotiable Instrument Act also, unless and until the contrary is proved. In 54 we also have the expression satisfactorily account for. Question before us is, what is the meaning of this expression? Now, general rule under the penal law is that as and when the prosecution has proved the offense against the accused beyond reasonable doubt, then the burden shifts upon the accused to raise a reasonable doubt in the case of the prosecution so as to earn the acquittal. Now, this general principle is displaced in certain statutory provisions, like in case of NDPS Act. Here the section 54 employs the expression unless and until the contrary is proved. So in order to wriggle out of the offense under the NDPS Act, once the presumption has been raised by the court, the accused cannot get away from the offense by simply raising doubt or chinks in the case of the prosecution. He has to prove his case on the standard of preponderance of probability, which definitely is a higher standard than what is adopted in general penal offences, that is casting a reasonable doubt. The second expression, satisfactorily account for, also indicates that the explanation furnished by the accused for having the possession of the contraband must not be only a vague explanation. It should be sufficiently probable explanation which is proved by means of an evidence, either direct or circumstantial, in a given situation or case. Now, the constitutional validity of these reverse burden clauses under the NDPS Act were challenged before the Honorable Apex Court in the case of Noor Agha versus State of Punjab. The Honorable Apex Court, after reviewing the jurisprudence of all the foreign countries as well as Indian context, upheld the constitutional validity of these reverse burden clauses. Two principles were also highlighted in this case. One is that presumption of innocence or the displacement of this presumption by carving out reverse burden clauses, it is not a fundamental right, it is only a human right. So it can be displaced by carving out such reverse burden clauses within the parameter of the Constitution. That is, these should satisfy the test of proportionality under the Constitution. These should also satisfy the test of fair trial under Article 21 as well as Article 14 of the Constitution. Now, after reviewing the entire material on the record, the Supreme Court laid down the following principles with regard to the reverse burden clauses under the NDPS Act. The first principle is the provision of 35 and 54 are not ultra vires, the Constitution of India. But in order to raise these presumptions, the procedural requirement laid down in the Act are required to be strictly complied with. Third is the factum of recovery has to be proved beyond all reasonable doubt by the prosecution, which is required to be established before the reverse burden clauses operate. Last is recoveries effected under the Act have to be made as per the procedure established by law. Now I must enter a caveat over here that all of you would agree to this fact that over the years, both the legislature as well as the courts in India have diluted the procedural requirement under the Act. There has been large scale dilution if we examine the evolution of the case law in this area. Similarly, the Constitutional Bench of the Apex Court in Baldev Singh case also held that a presumption under 54 can be raised only after the prosecution has established that the accused was found in possession of the contraband in a search conducted in accordance with the mandate of 50. An illegal search does not entitle the prosecution to raise a presumption under section 54. Now, after having said this, let us see how practically these reverse burden clauses are going to operate under the scheme of NDPS Act. Now, if we survey the case law on the subject, we will agree or we will find that there is no clear-cut criteria given by the courts for the subordinate courts to follow in this context. Rather, it increases the confusion. I'll refer to a few cases where contradictory phrases have been used in the judgments. The correct way from the analysis of the case law on the entire subject indicates that the approach which should be adopted by the courts, the trial courts, while adjudicating cases under the NDPS Act is that first of all, the prosecution will have to prove the factum of possession of the contraband by the accused beyond reasonable doubt, because this is the foundational fact before the permissive presumption by the court can be raised. Thereafter, only the accused can be called upon to satisfactorily account for his possession. Now, here I must I may share with you one fact regarding NDPS Act, that section 8 of the NDPS Act, which is the fulcrum around which the whole of the Act revolves, mention number of acts or activities or operations. Section 8 and 8A, they both are prohibitory in nature. The remaining sections in that chapter, that is section 9 onwards till section 14, they are regulatory in nature. Section 8 and 8A prohibits certain operations or activities in relation to the contraband, that is narcotic drugs, psychotropic substances and controlled substances. Now, if we examine section 8, we'll find that it prohibits the possession, the transport, transshipment, interstate, import, export, so and so forth. And if we examine section 9 onwards, there you will find that the competent authority can issue licenses, permits, authorization to carry on such kind of activities in respect of the contraband. Then next important factor is that if we examine the offences, that is chapter 4 of the Act, from section 15 onwards, you will find that in the definition of the offences, there is no word like knowledge, intention, reasons to believe, or any shade of mens rea is missing in the offences part. There are only 4 provisions in the Act where the shade of mens rea or the element of mens rea has been specifically mentioned. In the remaining penal provision or charging provision, there is no mention of the element of mens rea. Then the question arises before us that whether the offences under the NDPS Act are absolute in nature or whether they impose strict liability under the Act, or the element of mens rea would be read by applying the principle of interpretations in this area of law. Now, the survey of the case law on the point clearly indicates that despite the absence of the express element of mens rea in the charging section under the NDPS Act, the element of mens rea has to be read in each of the acts or operations under all the charging sections. Like cultivation, if on somebody's land there is a wild growth of some kind of let us say cannabis plant or opium poppy plant, and the person doesn't have the knowledge regarding that, now it will not amount to the intentional or knowingly cultivating such kind of contraband, and it would not amount to any offense. Similarly, in case of possession also, unless the possession is conscious, that is with knowledge, awareness, it doesn't amount to any offense under the Act. Now, next point is, in order to find whether the prosecution has discharged its initial burden of proving the foundational fact, the court will have to examine whether the provisions of the Act as regards search and seizure have been adhered to. Now here what the courts have done is they have classified or grouped all the procedural prescriptions under the NDPS Act into mandatory and non-mandatory provisions. The violation of mandatory provision is generally considered fatal, vitiating the recovery. The effect of this is that the evidence collected in infraction of this provision is not to be taken into consideration by the court, and it has to be eschewed from consideration. The violation of the non-mandatory provisions has to be seen in the entire gamut of the facts and circumstances of the case, and the court has to reach the conclusion whether its infraction reflects upon the authenticity of the case of the prosecution. Now, in the former category of in the first category, that is where there is a violation of the mandatory provision, it is not permissible to the court to raise the presumption under Section 84 of the Act against the accused. While in the latter case, the court may raise the presumption depending upon its conclusion as to the above parameter. Now we can just refer to few judgments. I was just sharing with you that after Noor Agha case, the Honorable Apex Court has not adopted a consistent approach in relying upon these reverse burden clauses under the Act. In Noor Agha case, we have already referred to the principles which were carved out. Now I can share it with you certain cases of the Apex Court where contradictory phrases have been employed by the Honorable Apex Court. In Mohanlal case, the Apex Court stated that the prosecution is required to establish a prima facie case beyond reasonable doubt after investigation, and thereafter the burden of proof shall reverse on the accused. Whereas this is quite misleading and confusing. In Noor Agha case, it was clearly held by the Apex Court that it is the duty of the prosecution to prove the foundational fact, that is the physical recovery of the contraband beyond reasonable doubt. So till that is proved, the reverse burden clauses would not kick in. Whereas in Mohanlal case, though it relied upon noor aga, but it used a different phrase. Now, prima facie case is a sort of a different parameter which requires different standard to establish. Like while framing charge, the courts on the criminal side only examine whether a prima facie case is made out on the material which is there on the record without testing that material on the touchstone of the principles of the Evidence Act. But here, prima facie case beyond reasonable doubt is somewhat misleading. Then in Hanif Khan case, the Honorable Apex Court again relied upon noor aga case, but it further lowered the bar of proving the case on the prosecution. It stated that prosecution is required to establish only a prima facie case, that's all, and thereafter the burden shifts to the accused. This again is not in line with the noor aga case. The moment the charge is framed, prima facie case is established. Now we cannot say that at that very stage, the reverse burden clause has kicked in and it is for the accused to prove otherwise. Because I've already shared with you while dealing with the test evolved by the judicial courts, in such kind of a situation, the reverse burden clause would fall foul of or would transgress the constitutional limits itself. Then we have the case of Dharampal, where the Supreme Court said that Section 54 creates a legal fiction, which again is not in line with either the statutory provision or noor aga case. Legal fiction is entirely different from presumption or reverse burden clauses. In legal fiction, once the fact is presumed or assumed, no contrary evidence can be led to disprove it. Whereas in case of presumption, it only shifts the burden of proof, and once the other party is able to lead the evidence, it disappears, it gets dislodged. Then in Bhola Singh case, it's in another, you can say, instance of misapplication of law. Here the Honorable High Court had convicted the accused whose truck was employed for transporting the contraband by invoking Section 35, which relates to the presumption regarding the mens rea part on the part of the accused. But the Honorable Supreme Court held that it is for the prosecution to prove the mens rea. So no notice of Section 35 was taken off. So I'm just highlighting these judgments just to indicate that while adjudicating cases, the principle of noor aga case should not be ignored and should be kept in mind. Now, next part is that, as we have said, that in order to prove the foundational facts by the prosecution, the recovery must have been effected according to the procedure provided under the NDPS Act. Now here the courts, if we see the scheme of the Act, we will find that the NDPS Act divides the procedural prescriptions into two broad categories. One is pre-recovery procedural prescriptions and second is post-recovery procedural prescriptions. Now, so far as the pre-recovery procedural prescriptions are concerned, the NDPS Act divides these into three broad categories. There is classification, you will notice. The first classification is on the basis of warrants or authorization. So whether the search and seizure is with warrant, whether the search and seizure is with authorization, whether the search and seizure is without warrants or authorizations. Now here in the first classification, we have twofold of authorities who are entitled to act under the Act. One is judicial magistracy and second is the gazetted rank officers as well as the other empowered officers under the Act. And you will also notice that so far as the safeguards are concerned, the judicial magistracy where they are entitled to act, you will find lesser degree of procedural safeguards, and where the executive officers are going to act under the Act, you will find more procedural safeguards are to be complied with. There also there are twofold bifurcation where the gazetted officer is going to act, lesser procedural safeguards, where empowered officers lesser than gazetted officer are going to act, more procedural requirement are to be complied with. This we can find in section 41, 42 of the Act. Second classification is on the basis of place. We have two broad division. One category is that where search and seizure is to be effected in any building, conveyance or enclosed place. Second is where it is to be effected in a public place or in transit. Now this classification flows from Article 21 of the Constitution of India. It basically intends to protect the right of privacy of the subject. In those places, that is buildings, enclosed places, conveyance, I'll just refer to why conveyance has been used along with building and enclosed place. They refers to the private bastions of the individual, and he has got the right to privacy, and therefore if any intrusion is to be made into these places, it requires a higher degree of safeguards which have been provided in the Act. Now I was referring to the term conveyance, that why the term conveyance has been used along with building or enclosed place, though it is not defined as such in the Act. But if we take the cue from the international conventions on the basis of which this Act has been drafted, then you will often find in foreign countries there is a concept of van dwelling, where a vehicle is modified in the shape of a house and a person lives in that conveyance. So therefore, if intrusion is required to be made into that conveyance, then greater procedural safeguards are required to be complied with. Similarly, we may also have certain tribes in India who keep on moving in their vehicles from one place to other place, and if they are stationed in the vehicle where they are sleeping or living, then that would also require compliance of these procedural safeguards which are there in section 41, 42 of the Act. Second bifurcation is that where search and seizure is to be effected in a public place or when the conveyance is in transit. In these two situations, you will notice under 43, there is no procedural safeguard as such, which we find in section 42 and 41 of the Act. Third classification is on the basis of personal search and the articles being searched. Here also you will notice it again intends to protect the personal life and liberty and right to privacy of the individual. Whenever a personal search is to be effected, greater procedural safeguards as stated in section 50 of the Act are required to be complied with. But where the articles are required to be searched, then we do not require to comply with the procedural safeguards given in section 50 of the Act. Now here if we examine the evolution of the case law on section 50, initially the courts had taken the position that personal search was defined in a very wider fashion. It included the human body, the person of the human body, plus anything which he is carrying on his body or in his hands. So if he is carrying a bag on his head, if he's holding a bag in his hands, if he is hiding something in his clothes, whatever it is. So everything was included within the ambit of personal search. Then over the period of time, this was diluted by the courts and a clear-cut bifurcation was made that personal search means search of the human body or the clothes or the footwear which a human person, which a human being wears while moving about in the society. But anything which he is carrying, either a bag or whatever it is, or holding in his hands, that would not be included within the ambit of personal search. In between, we must have come across certain cases which establish the test of inextricable connection in such cases. That if somebody is holding a polythene bag in his fist and it cannot be extracted unless force is employed and taken away from the human body, then according to some cases, section 50 was applicable and it used to be complied with, but now they have clear-cut, there's a clear-cut demarcation made by the courts that in no situation any article which is carried, even if it is holding in his fist or on his head or carrying on his body or hung on his shoulder, those would not be included within the ambit of personal search under section 50. So this test has been discarded of late, which was earlier in operation in the intervening stages. Then next part is post-recovery procedural prescriptions under the Act. When post-recovery, we have section 52, which deals with the disposal of persons arrested and articles seized. Second is disposal of seized contraband, which includes conforming to the following steps, that is forwarding of the case property to the officer in charge, preparation of an inventory, filing of application before the magistrate, drawing of sample, certifying it, taking photographs, and certification of the inventory by the magistrate. Then the charge of the articles to be taken in by the police during the intervening period from its recovery till its production, section 55. Report of arrest and seizure 55, link evidence, infraction of standing instructions of 1989 and 2015, supplemented by the decision of the Honorable Apex Court rendered in Mohanlal case for sampling, handling and disposal of case property. Then there are certain miscellaneous matters which are not as such in the Act, like non-production of case property, complainant police officer being the investigating officer, non-dispatching of the CFSL form, delay in dispatching this form, non-examination of material witnesses, offer of self-search by the IO before effecting personal search or house search, association of stock witness in such proceedings. Now, the idea of referring to all these pre-recovery and post-recovery procedural prescription was that it should be clear in our mind while applying the reverse burden clauses under the NDPS Act that these procedural prescriptions have to be complied with. Mandatory one, those are fatal. These directory one, we have to evaluate in the light of the entire gamut of fact and circumstances. And once we reach the conclusion that yes, the prosecution has crossed the first threshold, that is, it has proved the physical possession of the contraband by the accused, then only we will apply section 35 first to supplement the element of mens rea, and then we will move on to section 54 and raise the presumption accordingly that he has committed the offence, and thereafter only at the fourth stage the burden of proof will be reversed upon the accused to prove to the contrary. We can also probably quickly share regarding the effect of non-compliance of these pre-recovery and post-recovery procedural prescriptions. 42(1) and 2 its non-compliance is fatal, but if there is a delayed compliance with satisfactory explanation, that has been made acceptable by the courts. Non-compliance of CRPC proceedings regarding search and seizure, these can only be taken note of while appreciating the evidence of the witnesses, but these are not per se, these will not render the search and seizure per se illegal. Infraction of 55 is fatal, and any evidence collected therefrom has to be eschewed from consideration. Similarly, section 52 and 57, these are directory in nature and will have an effect on the appreciation of evidence regarding arrest, search and seizure. Then so far as informant part is concerned, the matter has been referred to the larger bench. Non-production of case property. Now this non-production of case property can assume importance in two situations. First is where the case property is available with the prosecution and has not been destroyed in accordance with the rules stipulated by the central government under section 52A1. That is the standing instruction of 89 and 2015. Second is where an inventory has not been prepared as per the provision of 52A. Otherwise, 52A says that inventory certified by the magistrate itself will be the primary evidence. But if it has not been prepared strictly according to the provision of 52A, in that situation, the non-production of case property will assume importance and may prove fatal or not fatal depending upon the gamut of entire gamut of facts and circumstances of the case. Then next is non-observance of the standing instructions for sampling, seizure, etc. Again, these are not per se fatal, but the court can draw an adverse inference against prosecution to the effect that had such evidence been produced, the same would have gone against the prosecution. Again, these are relevant for appreciating the evidence of the prosecution witnesses. Now, the third segment is the presumptions or the reverse burden clause under the Prevention of Corruption Act. Now, section 20 is relevant in this context. This presumption can be raised in respect of offences under section 7 or 11. Now, this act has been amended by the Amendment Act of 2018, making drastic changes under the act, rationalizing the entire act itself. Earlier, the presumption was attracted in respect of offences under 13(1)(a), (b), 12, 14(b) as well as 7 and 11. Now these have been omitted under the new act. 13(1)(a) and (b), probably if those who have gone through the Prevention of Corruption Act, were the aggravated nature of offences under section 7 and 11 of the act. That is habitual offenders or habitual committing of the act barred by section 7 and 11. Now these have been submerged in section 7 and 11 because these provision only provided for the enhanced punishment. Now the same punishment has been given in the principal provision itself, that is section 7 and 11 itself. Second point is the presumption is legal in nature and not permissive, meaning thereby the court does not have any discretion whether to attract the presumption or not. It is obligatory upon the court to raise it. The provision is in two parts. The first is the foundational fact, which is required to be proved by the prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. And second is the presumed fact under section 20. Now the foundational fact which the prosecution is required to prove beyond reasonable doubt is that the public servant has accepted or obtained or attempted to obtain for himself or for any other person any undue advantage from any person. Now these are the words which have been used under the present act. Undue advantage. It has been defined in the act. It is just like putting the old wine in a new bottle. In the earlier act, we had the word illegal gratification, but now we have the word undue advantage. This word has been taken from the United Kingdom Bribery Act 2010 and the International Convention. Though there the word used was a financial advantage and another advantage, but this phrase which was used in the bill was modified to undue advantage on the recommendation of the Law Commission of India. Now the word accepted, obtained, they also carry significance. Acceptance means willingly taking something, not something thrusted upon a person. Like we take one example, if a person thrusts the currency in the pocket of a public servant and he's trying to ward it off and immediately he is trapped, this act will not amount to acceptance under the PC Act. There must be a willingness to accept the same. Obtained. Now the word obtained has been used in contradistinction with the term acceptance. In obtained, the effort or there is some kind of act on the part of public servant to secure the undue advantage. Now, sometimes the question arises is like the term obtained will also include extorting bribe from somebody or pressurizing somebody to give the bribe or adopting such a kind of practice in doing the official act where one is prompted to offer the bribe to the public servant. So there is some kind of effort on the part of a public servant whenever there is a concept of obtaining the undue advantage. Now, sometimes the question arises whether mere acceptance or whether mere demand would amount to the offense under the act. The answer is yes. A mere demand is sufficient to be covered within the ambit of the Prevention of Corruption Act because it gets covered under the phrase attempted to obtain. So mere attempt to obtain, that is demand being raised by the public servant to seek the undue advantage, is covered within the ambit of this act. But this foundational fact is required to be proved by the public servant beyond, by the prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. Now the second part is what fact is to be presumed under section 20 of the act. The court shall presume regarding the fact that the public servant who has accepted, obtained or attempted to obtain the undue advantage, it was as a motive or reward for the performance of or to cause performance of a public duty improperly or dishonestly, either by himself or another public servant or taking some undue advantage without consideration or inadequate consideration. So this connecting link that this acceptance or obtainment of undue advantage which has got connection with the performance or omission to perform the public duty or public function either improperly or dishonestly, this connection will be presumed under section 20 of the act. Now here also you will find the word improperly, dishonestly. These have been added by the act of 2018. Earlier these were not used. Now this word improperly again has been taken from the UK Bribery Act of 2010. It has not been defined in the Prevention of Corruption Act. What does the word improperly mean? But it takes its color. The test which is relevant for this is a test of reasonable expectation. That is, If a public servant is required to perform a duty impartially, or he's required to perform his duty in the shape of trust without biasness, and he has exercised biasness, or there's partiality in the performance of his duty, then it will be covered within the ambit of term improperly. It's a word of a wide significance and can cover varied situations and acts of a public servant. Dishonestly is defined in the IPC, which means causing wrongful gain or wrongful loss to somebody. Now, after this, then only the onus will shift upon the accused to prove the contrary, and he is to discharge this burden on the touchstone of preponderance of probability. Again, the word which has been used in section 20 is unless and until contrary is proved. So the presumption can be raised at the initial stage. It has to be rebutted. It can't be rebutted by merely giving a plausible explanation, but should be found true as well. The nature of burden resting upon the public servant can't be higher than establishing the case on preponderance of probability. We will skip this part. We can just refer to the last segment, that is Negotiable Instrument Act. Here we have got twofold provision raising two different kind of presumptions. One is section 1118, which raises a legal presumption as to certain factors regarding validity of a negotiable instrument. These factors are that negotiable instrument was given for a consideration, date of making, drawing, time, etc. The opposite party is required to rebut this presumption on the touchstone of balance of probability. Then section 139 raises legal presumption in favor of a holder of a check that he received the check for the discharge of any debt or other liability. Now, initially the courts were of the view that there is no presumption that the debt or the liability is legal in nature. Now, this observation was made in Krishna Janardhan Bhatt case, but this has not been approved of in Rangappa case, where the apex court said that in the event the accused is able to raise a probable defense which creates doubt, the presumption was that the check was issued in respect of a legal debt or a legal liability. So in the event the accused is able to raise the probable defense which creates doubt with regard to the existence of debt or liability, the presumption may fail, and then again the burden shall shift upon the prosecution. Now, in Janardhan Bhatt case, the apex court, we can skip this part. We can refer to the few principles which have been laid down in Rangappa case on section 139. The presumption mandated by 139 of the Act does indeed include the existence of a legally enforceable debt or liability. In Janardhan case, this was not so held. Second is that 139 is an example of reverse onus clause that has been included in furtherance of the legislative objective of improving the credibility of negotiable instruments. The test of proportionality should guide the construction and interpretation of reverse onus clauses. In the absence of compelling justifications, reverse onus clauses usually imposes an evidentiary burden and not a persuasive burden. Evidentiary burden simply means that accused would be required to either raise a doubt regarding the presumed fact, or on the basis of balance of probability, he is required to raise a doubt on that. Once that is done, the burden again shifts upon the prosecution to prove it otherwise. Persuasive burden means, which we also call as legal burden, means that the party is required to discharge this burden beyond reasonable doubt. I've already stated that if a reverse onus clause imposes a persuasive burden, then in that case it shall transgress the constitutional limits and would not be valid. Then again, the phrase until contrary is proved, I've already stated. It simply means that on the touchstone of preponderance of probability, then how this presumption can be rebutted by the accused under the Negotiable Instrument Act. He can either adduce direct evidence to prove whatever defense he takes, or on the material on the basis of record, if the probability of his defense is shown, then also the burden shall again shift to the prosecution to prove it otherwise. Now, principles, the Apex Court has summed up the principles also in this regard. Probably I am exceeding the time, so I shall now sum up this. Chetan, can we move on to the question answer session?
So certainly, we already have a few questions. In the meantime, I'll request everyone to now can post your question in the question answer section, and sir will take it from there. So we have questions right now, so I'll start with those while we get more questions. First of all, thank you for summarizing it in an hour. I understand it's a big topic, and I think 1 hour is fairly a very less time. But considering that we also have to address questions over here, so I'll start with this, sir. So it's not a question, it's a request that could you please throw some light on presumptions under Section 29 and 30 of POCSO Act in respect to whether it absolves the prosecution to prove its case beyond shadow of reasonable doubt.
Probably I need the POCSO Act. If the officer can read the presumption.
So I can request, I don't have the name over here of the person who has asked the question. We can probably request member.
We can take the next question, and in the meantime, I'll call for this POCSO Act. We can take the next question in the meantime.
Or we can also request the member to just simply put that provision over here, so we can read that from here itself.
I'll just call the Bail Act. Probably that will be much easier.
So, the question is about while convicting an accused, how to reconcile between Section 54 and 35.
All right. Now I've already stated that so far as 35 and 54 are concerned, they both operate in distinct, we can say, fields. 35 is only meant to supplant the element of guilty mind or mens rea in the NDPS offences. Let us take few examples. Now let us suppose the prosecution is able to show that accused A is found in physical possession of the contraband. Now he says his possession is not conscious because while he was standing at a public place, one passerby requested him to hold this article while he wanted to use the lavatory, let us say at the bus stop or at the railway station. Now this particular fact, that is the mens rea part, whether his possession is conscious or not conscious, it will be difficult for the prosecution to prove it. Therefore, 35 only helps the prosecution by relieving it from the proving of the element of mens rea and supplanting it by raising a presumption in its favor by virtue of Section 35. So therefore, 35 only supplants or supplies the element of mens rea in the NDPS offences once the physical act or connection is proved by the prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. Now 54 is different. Now once the physical recovery is also proved, mens rea is also supplied by Section 35, then 54 helps the prosecution by asking or requesting the court to raise a presumption of guilt, from the mere possession of either contraband or other paraphernalia or certain other things regarding the commission of the actual offense. So therefore, 54 operation is different. Now let me tell you, 54, this presumption is permissive. It is optional. So it may happen in a given situation that a prosecution is able to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. In that eventuality, there is no need for the prosecution to fall back upon Section 54. It is not required because the case already stands proved beyond reasonable doubt on the basis of the evidence already on the record. 54 will kick in only in those situations where you find that either the procedural provisions, which I have already referred to, are not strictly complied with. There are certain lapses on the part of prosecution, but still the recovery part is proved and the prosecution is requesting the court to rely upon 54 and raise the presumption of guilt against the accused regarding the commission of the offence. So probably am I clear on this?
So I think if there's any other question on this, we'll get it in the questions subsequently. I'll move to the next one. This is also in regards to NDPS Act. The question is, can there be suspicion of sentence in case of conviction under NDPS Act at any stage, trial or appeal?
Now, so far as Section 389 is concerned, probably in the Dadu case, it has already been held that so far as the appellate courts are concerned, they can definitely suspend the sentence. Now, the problem which the trial courts face is that suppose in a small quantity offence, the accused is convicted, let us say for a period of 2 years, 3 years, and he moves an application under 389 CRPC asking to suspend the sentence because he wants to file the appeal in the next higher court.
In the next court, yes.
So probably, so far as my survey of case law is concerned, in most of the cases, the courts have taken the view that 389, this part would not be applicable to the trial courts, except for one judgment of the Guwahati High Court, which said that yes, 389 can be applied even by the trial court once they convict the accused for the period of up to this 3 years. Because there is another controversy correlated to this, which I would like to quickly, regarding which I would like to quickly make 2 points. Sure. That the small quantity offences are bailable under the Act, but generally in the trial courts, these are being treated as non-bailable. So therefore, that's another controversy, though I don't have the time to elaborate upon that. But the offences of which are punishable up to 3 years under the Act are bailable in nature.
So you spoke about the example that the person has given an article to someone, he went to use a lavatory. Something on the similar lines, but now this is about a field. The question is by Mr. Neeraj Goyal, sir. He says, how can accused be proved that his possession of contraband is not conscious or growth of cannabis, etc., plant in his field was not within his knowledge? And he can at the most make his own deposition in this regard in the court. And if he makes such deposition, then can court believe or accused will have to prove something else also?
Yes. In this regard, so far as the this defense part is concerned, or disproving that any of the acts or operation under the Act was not with the guilty mind, he can definitely disprove it. Now, for that, he can either rely upon the circumstantial evidence, that is one part. Second, he can either go for the direct evidence. Now, let us take one example. Suppose I am the one who has the agricultural land, but I am not well conversant with the agricultural operations, and I employ, let us say, third party to for sowing and harvesting purpose.
So
now, let us say I've got 10 acres of land, and certain plants of cannabis or opium poppy plant, they grow on the other end of the field, and I am the absentee landlord also. Let us say I reside in Chandigarh, but I have got an agricultural land in some other place where I used to visit maybe once a month or maybe for a longer duration. Now, if I'm able to establish all these circumstantial evidence, and let us say only 2 or 3 or 4 plants were growing in the entire field of wheat or paddy. Now, from this entire gamut of facts, I can definitely prove that the possession was not conscious, or the cultivation of this plant was not with requisite knowledge. So therefore, these can definitely be rebutted by the accused by leading evidence on the record. And so far as like the example I shared, where he said that the passenger went to the lavatory and handed over the goods. So now he can probably bring on record. He can probably bring on record the circumstantial evidence. He can also bring on record the witnesses, those who were present at the spot when he was handed over the bag. There can be a CCTV footage at the public place which can show that he was handed over the bag by some other passenger and he went to the lavatory to use it. So therefore, there can be gamut of facts from which he can disprove the mens rea element in NDPS offences.
So next question is about again about NDPS Act. The question is pertaining saying if the story of prosecution is that the accused was suspected to be of bad element and he was stopped, and then investigation officer suspected that he might be having some narcotics substances in his possession. Now, whether in such case, before making search of compliance of Section 50 of NDPS Act is required to be made or not?
Yes, it is mandatory. In no situation it can be dispensed with. Now here I would like to bring to your notice that by the Amendment Act of 2001, the legislature has diluted the provision of Section 50 by carving out clause 5 and 6 under the Act. That is, in emergency situations which are there under the Act itself, stipulated in these clauses, where the investigating officer can dispense with the requirement of Section 50 and effect the full personal search without making any offer of the search before the gazetted officer or the magistrate. So you can refer to those clauses. What are the grounds under which he can dispense with this? And secondly, even if in those situations they have added additional safeguards which he is required to comply with while effecting such kind of emergency searches.
Okay, sir. So now the question is from Rewari Naresh Kumar sir, ADJ sir. The question is that there are no evidence. So it's a scenario. There are no evidence against the accused facing the trial. Whether accused can be convicted on the basis of presumption under NDPS Act.
In no situation. I've already stated that.
Yes, we have.
Yes. Where the legislature makes a presumption of such kind, which makes a presumptive assumption of the guilt of the accused and cast a reverse burden upon him to disprove his innocence, such kind of reverse burden clauses would transgress the constitutional limits and would be considered ultra vires.
Before I move to the next question, there are a lot of in the question section itself. There's a lot of comments that I'm reading right now, and which members are saying that it's nicely presented. All the questions are already answered during your detailing. So I think a lot of people are not even answering questions because they have questions are already answered during your detailing. But there are still few questions. I will just move to those. Question from Naresh sir again. Whether anticipatory bail can be granted under Section 438 of CRPC without invoking the provision of 37 of NDPS Act?
Yes. Now, in this regard, so far as anticipatory bail is concerned, in respect of the additional conditions which are applicable in respect of certain categories of offences, that is offences involving commercial quantity or Section 19, etc., which are there, the anticipatory bail is maintainable. Secondly, the anticipatory bail can be granted only subject to the fulfillment of these three conditions which are there, and it cannot be granted de horse the conditions.
So now, so moving on the next question. This question is about you, sir. You spoke about discharging negative facts, the burden of discharging negative facts. Now, the question is pertaining to that. Uh, in regards to burden of discharging negative facts by accused in licensing cases, could you please explain further into that? Could you please explain more on those lines?
Yes. Now, in some of, rather in many cases, you will find that where the carrying on of an activity or a possession of something is totally prohibited under the law, and it is only permitted subject to the authorization or license or permit by the competent authority. This you often find in the NDPS Act. This we often find in the liquor business, that where the activity as such is prohibited, and it is permitted only in certain situations, and that too after obtaining the requisite permission from the competent authority. Now there, if the person is found carrying on that activity or in possession of that particular article, then whether he has the license, whether he has the authorization or the permit, is definitely within his own knowledge. So casting a burden upon the prosecution to prove such a fact, in addition to proving the first fact, would be asking more than necessary. So therefore, the law says in such kind of cases, this burden can be easily discharged by the accused, and therefore burden is cast upon him.
Sir, something similar. So the question now is burden of proof in small quantity of burden of proof in small quantity recoveries is same as heavy recoveries.
Yes, yes. These reverse burden clauses will operate in all the offences, whether irrespective of whether they are commercial or they are small.
Okay, sir.
Procedural part is same. Whatever we have discussed, this is applicable to all the offences. That is only relevant in respect of the punishment part.
Okay.
Not otherwise.
Okay. Now, so we spoke about two examples. One was the bus stand example, and the one was about the field example when the person was growing cannabis and he was unaware of that. Now, I think this question is again, it's a scenario which has been shared. The question is that if three persons hailing from the same village and they're riding a motorcycle, and one of the pillion rider has a possession of 50 grams of heroin in his pocket, whether the presumption of culpability can be raised against other two who are on the bike as well.
Yes, Chetan. Now this question pertains to the concept of joint possession under the law. Now, so far as possession is concerned, it is a myriad concept which will include varied situations. But generally we say that possession can be actual, it can be symbolic, it can be constructive. Section 27 IPC probably we all are aware of, where the possession of the article by the wife, servant or the employee on behalf of his master or husband is considered to be the possession of only the master, husband, and not that of the wife or the servant. That is one you can say example of constructive possession.
So,
second is possession can be individual also, it can be joint also. In individual possession probably there is no difficulty. In joint possession, the test engrafted by the judicial court is the test of joint enterprise. Unless and until the prosecution is able to prove either by direct evidence or by circumstantial evidence that it was the joint enterprise of all the accused, joint possession cannot be attributed to all the accused. Now let us take this, we can amplify this very example which our learned friend and officer has shared with us, that if three persons are riding the motorbike and the pillion rider is carrying something in his pocket. Now if these are the only facts produced by the prosecution, without there being any other extra fact, joint possession cannot be attributed to all the persons. But suppose if in addition to this, they're able to show that they all three went together to the source from which they got this heroin, though it was being carried by one of the accused in his pocket, then we can say that here there is additional evidence that they all went together.
Yes, sir.
They bought it by paying the money and got it from the source, though one was carrying only in his pocket. Then joint possession can be attributed to all the three accused.
So I think thank you for this answer. I think this was a question asked by three other members as well, and I think I'm not going to ask the same question again. It was asked in a different manner, but I hope with this one question you have answered 4 questions in total. So I move to the next question.
Yes,
so the next question is. While preparing inventory under Section 52 of NDPS Act, the magistrate does not have seal at that time. And then how do we deal with the situation and what would be the effect?
Now, the fact is that 52A, the presumption that the inventory, certified inventory will be the primary evidence will be displaced. That will not be taken note of. And then the other evidence on the record has to be led to prove the link evidence. Like I have already mentioned that in such if this is the case, then the non-production of the case property becomes a vital factor.
So first thing, Mr. Vivek Nasir has conveyed his best wishes and his thank you for this session. And he's asking for a question in respect to presumption of under Section 54 of NDPS Act,
Please.
Wherein on what basis would the court devise the said utensil is so specifically designed and to manufacture is a contraband?
Yes, sir. Thanks, sir, for this. Now, probably I'll just try to make a analogy with that of excise cases. Now, in excise cases also we come across a certain equipment which are used to distill the illicit liquor, and from that, because those particular kind of apparatus is being utilized for a particular purpose. Now, similarly, under the NDPS Act cases also, if you see the refinement process or certain other things, a particular kind of apparatus or the activity would be employed by the persons to do all those activities. Apart from that, there is another probably if when we revisited Section 54, that even the traces of the material which is used either as a raw material or as a finished product from the particular this utensils apparatus, these would also indicate that it was being used for the particular purpose. We have few English cases on the point also. I would quickly like to share one English case on the point. There was a case where this hookah bar sort of thing, and this apparatus was recovered by the investigating officer. It contained traces of cannabis in the cup of the apparatus. Now the question would be, and probably those traces were sufficient to indicate that this was used in the immediate precedent point of time. Now from such kind of things, if there is evidence of this nature, then presumption can definitely be raised.
Certainly, sir. Now the question is in respect to the POSCO Act. The member is requesting you to throw some light on Section 29 and 30 of POSCO
yes,
Act.
I've got the POSCO Act, and I'm going to refer to this POSCO now. 29 and 30, please. Now 29 says presumption regarding certain offences. It says where a person is prosecuted for committing or abetting or attempting to commit any offence under Section 3, 5, 7 and 9 of the Act, the court shall presume that such person has committed or abetted so and so unless the contrary is proved. Again, this presumption is regarding the commission of the offense. Now, if we compare Section 29 of POCSO Act with Section 54 of the NDPS Act, we notice one difference, that under 54 NDPS Act, the presumption is permissive in nature. That is, it is optional. The court may raise, may not raise. Yes, but here the presumption is of mandatory nature. That is, shall presume. Yes. Now again, the presumption would not be straightaway applicable. The presumption would be applicable only and only when the physical act of the accused, which has been stipulated in this charging section, that is section 3579, is proved beyond reasonable doubt by the prosecution. That is one. So far as the culpable mental state is concerned, that is supplied by section 30 of the act. I can share one case based upon this. There was a case in Chandigarh where a person has called a mechanic to repair the AC in his house. So in that room, his daughter was sleeping, a minor daughter was sleeping, and two mechanics came. The mechanic had placed his toolbox on the bed where that minor daughter was sleeping, and the allegation against the accused were that this accused has touched inappropriately the body of the victim, and she came rushing out of the room crying and telling her parents that what has happened. Now, the argument or the point taken by the accused was that he had placed his toolbox on the bed and he had accidentally touched upon the body of that girl. Now, whether the touching of the body of the victim with a guilty mind, that guilty mind element is supplied by section 30 of the POCSO Act. The onus is upon him to disprove it. Whatever defense he's taking, he has to obviously prove it. And second is, once the physical act, that is touching inappropriately the body, plus the guilty mind supplied by section 30, the court shall raise the presumption that he has committed the offense unless he prove it. Otherwise, contrary is proved. Again, this phrase means that he has to discharge his burden on the standard of preponderance of probability and not by raising a mere reasonable doubt in the case of the prosecution.
So, moving a bit on a different side, sir. Now the question is about RTIs. So the question by CJM sir from Gurdaspur is asking that why the documents received through RTI are disputed by the learned counsel for the parties.
All right. Now the question pertains to the Indian Evidence Act. For that, we need to refer to section 74, 75, 76 of the Evidence Act. Now, any document which is obtained under the RTI Act is in a totally different domain. If we examine the principles or the provisions of the Indian Evidence Act, we will find that for the purpose of proving the documentary evidence, one aspect is that document has been categorized into a private document or a public document. Now, so far as a public document is concerned, there is further twofold bifurcation in that. One set of public document is that which complies with the conditions of section, I think 75 or 76. I'm not sure on that, but he can definitely refer to those provisions. There are twofold conditions which are required to be satisfied. One is that the document must be open for inspection of general public. That is the first condition. Second condition is, under the rules or the law of the land, any person is entitled to obtain its certified copy by giving the charges for the same. When these two conditions are satisfied, only and only then, in respect of these public documents, these can be proved by giving the certified copy of the same. The remaining public documents, they do not fall within the ambit of this. Like take one example. In a criminal case, the IO, instead of filing the original MLR report, he files the photostat copy of the same.
So
my question is this a public document? MLR is public document? Answer is yes, it is, because the medical officer who has prepared this, he has done this in discharge of his official duty. Second is, can this be proved by its certified copy? Answer is no, it cannot, because this hospital record is not open for inspection of the general public, and nobody can walk in and ask for its certified copy. It is not satisfying the twin condition there in the Evidence Act. Now, so far as the RTI Act is concerned, it has got nothing to do with the Indian Evidence Act. So whatever is obtained, that is obtained for the purposes of his personal information under the RTI Act, and it will not override the provisions of the Indian Evidence Act.
So now, so as we were talking about RTI and then its relation to Evidence Act, there's another question on the same lines. So I just raised that question. Now, this is pertaining to what are the basic requirements for raising a presumption under Section 106 of the Evidence Act, and what are the prosecution to prove to raise the reverse burden clause?
Now, we have few examples of presumptions under the Indian Evidence Act also. Like my learned friend has referred to Section 106.
Yes, sir.
That is facts which are specially within the knowledge of the accused. Now, the scope of Section 106 has been limited by the judicial courts while interpreting Section 106. While finding the scope of Section 106, we have to clearly keep in mind the two illustrations which are appended to Section 106. If we refer to those illustrations, then by and large, like the case of a person traveling in a bus without a ticket, now whether he bought the ticket and he lost it, this is a fact which is especially within the knowledge, which he has to discharge it. Similarly, we find in Section 30B, 304B, 306, which relates to the abetment of a suicide of a married woman. There also, the fact which is cast upon the accused to prove is because the facts have taken within the domain of the house, which is a private place in the occupation of the accused, and it is only he and he who would best know how the deceased died, and therefore the reverse burden is cast upon him to disprove such kind of facts.
So question in respect to Negotiable Instrument Act, it says whether a presumption attached to an instrument under the NI Act, then why there's a need to prove the source of check amount?
Look, all these are additional factors which are, because I've already shared with the participants that initially the court had interpreted these provisions under the Negotiable Instrument Act, because if you see the wording also of 139, it doesn't say that the presumption is regarding the legal debt or legal liability. But subsequently, it's the Apex Code who had stated that the liability, which is this presumption which is to be raised, includes the existence of a legally enforceable debt or liability. So in between, we had a lot of confusion on this also, and that's why the source of the check amount or the legal liability was also definitely asked to be proved by the this complainant. But now probably if you go through the latest case law, you will find that they say that we can raise a presumption regarding the legally enforceable debt or liability. In that situation, that factor may not be of much importance, but if it comes on the record, that will add to the case of the complainant.
So, thank you for the detail. Question now in respect to the reverse onus clauses. The question is that nowadays such kind of reverse onus clauses are generally seen in various legislation. What are the reasons behind it?
All right. Now, there is a legislative policies behind enacting reverse burden clauses. One is the expediency, that is the necessity on the part of the anxiety on the part of the legislature to punish such kind of criminal acts which are much more dangerous to the society, or the offences are of a special class which the law needs to protect, like in case of children under the POCSO Act, like the legislative policy under the NDBS Act, like the legislative policy under the Corruption Act, and similarly in case of Negotiable Instrument Act also. So therefore there are policies which are the moving force for engrafting such kind of presumptions under the modern legislation. We invariably find in almost all the acts. One is that the casting of the burden to prove such kind of facts would be very much difficult for the prosecution and would entail, you can say, more burden upon the state resources. And vis-a-vis, if we compare this and shift the burden upon the accused to disprove it, then it will be quite easier for him to disprove the same. And in most of the cases, you will find that the activity or the act itself is totally prohibited or illegal. Like in case of corruption, taking bribe, it's totally an illegal act. NDPS, possessing or dealing with this contraband, is totally prohibited under Section 8 of the Act. So these are various legislative policies behind all these and grafting all these presumptions.
Thank you, sir. There was a case by the name of Mohan Lal in 2018.
Yes.
The question is that would you consider the law laid down in that case as a bad law?
But there are two Mohan Lal cases. One is regarding the IO, this complainant being the IO, and other is which I have already referred in my PPT also,
yes,
which is modified the 1989 and 2015 this standing instructions. So which Mohan Lal, probably my learned friend?
I think it's not really mentioned. It says 2018. So if that helps, sir.
2018 probably if it is regarding the IO part, that the complainant being the IO, then probably that is already under consideration of the larger bench before the Honorable Apex Court. I had also prepared a slide on this and shown it also specifically in Mukesh Singh versus State in 2019. This Mohan Lal case has been referred to the larger bench. So I refrain from giving my any personal opinion on the same.
Sir. Understood, sir. Moving ahead, I've shown the PPT to everyone that you were trying to show. Now this question is about NDPS Act. The question, it looks a bit incomplete though for me, but probably you will be able to understand the question completely, sir. The question is that is there an allegation that an accused has fled the spot, leaving some powdered contraband? Is the magistrate enjoined upon the take sample thereof, certify the inventory, etc., and order sending the drawn sample to the Office of Chemical Examiner in absentia of the accused, or is the case properly liable to be preserved till the accused is arrested?
All right. This is a very good question. Now, so far as this part is concerned, now the arrest or non-arrest of the accused is totally immaterial for complying with Section 52A. So even if the contraband was found from the spot, though the accused managed to flee from the spot, and it has not been arrested till yet. Despite that, the IO has to take all the procedural measures which are stipulated in the Act for preserving the case property, sampling and seizing the case property at the spot, producing that before the judicial magistrate, even if the accused is not being arrested, because the reason is if he keeps the case property with himself for that long a time, it may affect the link evidence in the case. So this part can be completed. The remaining part of the investigation, because this is only one of the these are only few steps which the IO has been mandated to take while investigating the offences under the NDPS Act. So it doesn't mean that in the absence of the accused he will not take all these steps. He has to take it and then complete the remaining part of the investigation by arresting the accused, so and so forth, and then he can put up the challan and all that.
So we have a last question for the session. We spoke about the Evidence Act 106 in few questions back. Now the question is that can 106 of Evidence Act be used for convicting an accused under section 411 of IPC when stolen property is recovered from his possession and there is no evidence to show that the accused had knowledge or reason to believe that the property was stolen?
No, it can't be used.
So, I think, sir, that brings us to the end of this webinar and the question answer round. There are few compliments that have been put in the question answer round for your session. One name is from Praveen Kumar, sir, who's a additional district and session judge at Panipat. Sir has said that thank you so much for an exhaustive and a knowledgeable session on reverse burden clauses, especially in regards to NDPS NI Act and the PC Act. And then there are a few comments anonymous that it was a wonderful session, very elaborative and very exhaustive session. So I think there's a list is huge for the compliments. But I think
Chetan, I would like to thank all the participants, all the judicial officers, and I thank so much for sparing their valuable time to hear me in this webinar. And I take the compliments in good spirits, and I'll try to improve upon my presentation in near future. And I thank them very much, all of them. Thank you so much, Chetan, for your coordination also. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, sir. So on behalf of everyone, I would first like to thank Sarah, sir, for taking our time and sharing all this knowledge and being open for so many questions. I would like to put this on record. Before the session got started, I was talking to sir that, should we open the question for half an hour, 45 minutes? And sir said, even if it takes 1.5 hours, 2 hours, keep the questions going. So I think that kind of attitude and that kind of, acceptance of that we want to share knowledge is very commendable, sir. So, and the members who had joined us, who taken a time, like Sarah sir said, thank you so much to the honorable members joining us from various parts of Punjab, Haryana. And on behalf of everyone, thank you everyone. And on behalf of all the members joining in, sir, Sarah sir, thank you so much for sharing this information.
Thank you everybody. Thank you, Chetan. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow in tomorrow's session at the same time, 11:30. And that will be all from my side. Thank you, everyone.
Please.